The first time Sera Whitlock touched me in 3 years, her fingers closed around my wrist in the middle of her sister's wedding reception, right as I was trying to disappear into the crowd near the bar. I had spent 2 days perfecting the art of not being in the same room as her, and it took her 4 seconds to undo it completely. "Not yet," she said, low enough that only I could hear it under the string quartet playing something soft and expensive. Then she was pulling me past a waiter balancing a tray of champagne flutes, through a side door I hadn't even noticed, into a small sitting room, lit by a single lamp and the gray wash of stormlight through tall windows. The door clicked shut behind her. I want to say I had a plan. I want to say I turned around ready, with something clever, something that would let me walk back out with my camera still around my neck, and my heart still exactly where I'd left it 3 years ago. Instead, I just stood there, staring at Seraphina Whitlock in lamplight, and thought, the way I always thought when I looked at her, that some women were built to make a room feel smaller. "Sera, why do you keep avoiding me?" Her voice was even. Sera's voice was always even. That was the thing about her. The thing the wedding blogs and her own mother liked to call cold. But I had spent one night, 3 years ago, learning what that voice sounded like when it wasn't controlled, and I knew this was as close as she came to shaking. "I'm working," I said. "I have a job to do. Your sister is paying me to document the happiest day of her life, not to hide in coat closets with her sister." "This isn't a coat closet." A muscle moved in her jaw. "And you didn't answer the question. Maybe I don't have an answer." "You have an answer. You've had it for 2 days. The rehearsal dinner, the ceremony, the family portraits, where you photographed every single person in this family, except me." She took a step closer, close enough that I could smell rain on her skin from wherever she'd been standing before she found me. "I have watched you leave every room I walked into since Thursday, Maeve. I want to know why." I laughed, and it came out wrong, too sharp for the space we were standing in. "You want to know why?" "Yes. You made it very clear 3 years ago that there was nothing to come back to." The words left me before I could soften them, before I could do what I always did and turn a feeling into a joke instead. "I heard you, Sera. I heard exactly what you thought of me." "You think you know what I thought?" Her eyes didn't leave mine, more green than gray in the lamplight. "You've built an entire version of me out of one sentence, and you've been running from it for 3 years instead of asking me if it was true. What was I supposed to do? Call you and ask you to repeat it?" "Yes." She said it simply, without apology. "You could have called. You could have shown up at one of the industry events where I stood in a corner an hour longer than I needed to, hoping you'd walk in with that camera and that canvas bag you refused to replace." I felt my throat tighten in a way I didn't want her to see. "I don't do that anymore. Hope, I mean. Not about people who've already told me where I stand." "Then let me tell you again, right now, where you stand." She took the last step that closed the distance between us entirely, close enough that I could count the rain-damp strands of hair that had escaped her pins, close enough to feel the warmth coming off her skin. "You stand exactly where you've always stood. I have simply been a coward about saying it." Something moved behind her eyes, some crack in the composure she wore the way other women wore pearls, inherited and constant, and impossible to take off in public. For one long second, I thought she might actually finish it. For 1 second, I thought 3 years of silence might finally break open in a dusty sitting room that smelled like old roses and unused furniture, candle smoke drifting faintly under the door from the ballroom beyond it. Then someone knocked, hard, 3 times, and a voice on the other side said, "Sera, I need you. It's Juliet." And whatever had almost surfaced in her face went back under, smooth as water closing over a stone. She looked at me a moment longer. "This isn't finished," she said, and left me alone in the lamplight with my pulse going too fast and my hands, traitors both of them, aching to have stayed closer to hers than they had. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. I gave myself 60 seconds in that room before I trusted my face enough to go back out into the reception. I have been a wedding photographer for 8 years, long enough to know that the guests never remember who was missing from a room for a minute, only who cried too loudly or danced too well. I smoothed my dress, checked my camera settings out of habit more than necessity, and walked back into the golden noise of Juliet Whitlock's wedding like nothing at all had happened to me. It had, though. It always did, around Sera. I found the service hallway behind the kitchen 20 minutes later, when the toasts were being cleared away, and I needed somewhere the string quartet couldn't follow me. Nina was already there, leaning against a rolling cart of dessert trays, eating a stolen macaron like she owned the place. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. "I saw Sera Whitlock." Same thing, historically. Nina handed me a macaron without asking if I wanted one, which was correct, because I did. "What happened?" She pulled me into a room and asked why I've been avoiding her for 2 days. "Because you have been avoiding her for 2 days. I've been documenting it. I could make a slideshow." Opening credits, dramatic music. Maeve Callahan changes direction across a ballroom every time a 5'9" brunette enters her field of vision. Nina tilted her head, studying me the way she studied a bride's face before a first look, watching for the truth under the makeup. "You're shaking a little." "I'm not." "Maeve." "I'm fine." I put the camera back up to hide behind, the oldest trick I had. "It's an old thing. It doesn't matter anymore. You've been telling me it doesn't matter anymore, since the week I met you, which was 3 years ago, which is suspiciously the same amount of time that woman has apparently not mattered." Nina wasn't wrong, and she knew she wasn't wrong, and she had the good grace not to push much harder than that. Not yet. She'd been my second shooter for 4 years, long enough to have earned the right to say things like this, and long enough to know exactly how far she could push before I shut the door on the conversation entirely. "You never talk about her. In 4 years of working together, I've heard more about your childhood dog than I've heard about whatever happened with Seraphina Whitlock. And I know for a fact something happened, because you turned down the Whitlock Foundation gala 2 years running before finally caving for Juliet's wedding. It wasn't anything we talked once at an event. You talked so hard you've been avoiding eye contact with a grown woman for 3 years. She popped the last bite of her macaron into her mouth and considered me with the particular patience of someone who has decided not to say the obvious thing out loud yet. "I'm not going to push. I know how you get. I'm just saying, for someone who built a whole career noticing the things other people try to hide, you're remarkably bad at noticing your own face when her name comes up." "My face is fine." "Your face just did the thing it does before you cry at other people's vow readings." She bumped my shoulder with hers, gentler now. "Go take your pictures, Callahan. I've got the dance floor and the cake cutting. Go breathe somewhere that isn't near the bar, and if you see her again, maybe try finishing a sentence instead of running the second one of you gets uncomfortable. Just a thought. From someone who's watched you do that with every woman you've almost let yourself fall for since I've known you." I didn't have an answer for that one, mostly because it was true, and I went. I found Juliet in a side parlor with her hands pressed to her stomach, breathing in the shallow, panicked way brides breathe when the day gets too big for the dress they're wearing. Her mother, Cordelia, stood near the window with her arms crossed, offering the kind of comfort that sounds like criticism if you listen closely, which I always did. "You're going to smear your face if you keep this up," Cordelia was saying. "Breathe like a person, Juliet, not like you're drowning." And then Sera was there, kneeling in front of her sister's chair without seeming to care that her silk skirt was pooling on a floor that hadn't been swept since the ceremony, taking Juliet's hands in both of hers. "Look at me," Sera said, and her voice had none of the ice it carried everywhere else in that house. "You are not going to ruin this day. You picked the wrong caterer's champagne, and Mom is being Mom, and none of it matters in 6 months. Breathe with me." I lifted my camera without thinking about it, the way I always did when a moment was too true to interrupt with a request to hold still. I caught Sera's face in profile, jaw soft for once, eyes fixed entirely on her sister, thumb tracing slow circles over Juliet's knuckles. I caught the exact second Juliet's breathing evened out because someone she trusted had told her it was allowed to. Cordelia saw me shooting and did not look pleased, but she said nothing, because saying something would have required admitting there was a tender moment worth objecting to. Later, when Juliet had been steadied and sent back out to her husband and the toasts and the enormous cake no one would eat all of, I stood in the hallway scrolling through the images on the back of my camera, and I let myself go back, for the first time in a long time, to the night that had started all of this. It had been a charity gala 3 years earlier, hosted by the Whitlock Foundation at this same estate, back before I photographed weddings for a living, and still took whatever work paid the rent, including evenings spent documenting rich people writing checks to causes they'd forget by breakfast. Sera had been the face of the foundation that year, moving through the crowd in green silk, polite and untouchable, the kind of beautiful that made people nervous instead of warm. I'd photographed her from a professional distance for 2 hours, the way I photographed everyone, until the storm knocked the power out sometime after 10, and half the guests fled for their cars before the roads flooded. I hadn't fled. I'd been in the middle of packing my gear in the estate's old greenhouse, where the foundation had staged a small dessert table earlier in the night, when the lights went out entirely and left me alone in the dark with the sound of rain hammering glass on every side. "You're still here," Sera had said, appearing in the doorway with a candle she must have grabbed from a hallway sconce, her voice different than the one she'd used all night, quieter, unguarded in a way I hadn't heard from her yet. "Someone has to pack up the camera gear. Apparently that someone is me." I'd held up my hands, damp from fumbling with a lens cap in the dark. "You could have evacuated with everyone else." "I don't evacuate." She'd set the candle on the potting table between 2 rows of white orchids, and in that small circle of light, for the first time all evening, she'd looked less like the cold Whitlock daughter the tabloids loved to write about, and more like a woman who was tired and a little bit lonely, and not entirely sure what to do with either feeling. I hate storms. I always have. But I hate more that everyone assumes I'm made of something that doesn't feel them. You don't seem like someone who cares what people assume. I've gotten good at not seeming like anything at all. She'd sat on the edge of the potting bench, careful of her dress, and looked at me with an honesty that had nothing to do with the polished woman working the room an hour earlier. "You photograph people all night, and you never once look bored doing it. How do you do that? Find something worth capturing in a room full of people performing generosity for a tax write-off. I look for the 2 seconds they forget they're performing." I'd sat across from her, close enough that the candlelight caught both our faces at once. "Everyone has one. Even you. You had this look, earlier, when a little girl brought you a drawing of a foundation dog. You didn't know anyone was watching. You saw that. I see everything. It's the job." I'd smiled, and she'd smiled back, small and real, the kind of smile I would spend the next 3 years trying to forget I'd ever earned. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're made of nothing. I think you've just never had anyone stick around long enough to find out otherwise." The rain had gotten louder against the glass roof, and somewhere in the 2 hours that followed, we talked the way you only talk to strangers you've decided to trust completely and immediately, about her mother's expectations, and my mother's 2 jobs, about the marriage Sera had already survived, and the ones I kept accidentally sabotaging, about how tired we both were of being useful to people instead of known by them. At some point, her hand had found mine on the potting bench, and at some point, I'd stopped pretending that was an accident, and at some point, with the candle burning low and the orchids fogging the glass around us, she'd leaned in close enough that I could feel her breath against my mouth, close enough that neither of us was breathing normally anymore, and I remember thinking, with my eyes already closing, that I had never wanted anything as much as I wanted whatever was about to happen. A groundskeeper's flashlight had swept across the glass outside, and a voice had called out asking if anyone was still in the greenhouse, and we'd broken apart so fast, Sera nearly knocked the candle over, both of us laughing a little too hard at nothing, both of us pretending the last 2 hours hadn't happened at all. I told myself, walking back to my car in the rain that night, that it had only felt enormous because the storm made everything feel enormous. I had believed that for exactly one more night, until I overheard 4 words the next morning that I let define 3 years I never should have handed over so easily. I thought about a greenhouse 3 years ago, and the way I had learned that Sera Whitlock's coldness in public was never the absence of feeling, it was the containment of it. She kept her heart the way some people keep a fire in a hearth, instead of letting it burn the house down. I had forgotten that, somewhere in 3 years of telling myself she felt nothing. Watching her with Juliet reminded me all at once. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke sometime after 10, sending half the guests scattering for cover under the estate's stone colonnade, while the band kept playing to an emptier dance floor. I slipped out onto the side terrace instead, the one that overlooked the cliffs and the black churn of the ocean below, because I needed air that didn't smell like candle wax and other people's happiness, and because some part of me, if I'm honest, had been hoping all night that she'd be somewhere I could find her alone. Sera was already there. She stood at the stone railing in the rain with her updo coming loose at her temples, not sheltering, not moving, just watching the water, like it had personally wronged her. The floodlights along the cliff path caught the rain in long silver lines around her, and for a moment I just stood in the doorway and watched, the way I watched everything, cataloging the shape of her before I let myself close the distance. Her hands, when I got close enough to see them, were shaking. Not from cold. I knew that shake. I had seen it once before, in a greenhouse, right before she almost kissed me, and something in my chest recognized it faster than my brain could catch up and warned me to be careful. "You'll ruin the dress," I said, because it was easier than anything true. "It's not my dress to ruin. It's Juliet's day." She didn't turn around. "Go back inside, Maeve." "No." That got her to look at me. Rain had streaked down her jaw and throat, catching in the hollow of her collarbone, and without deciding to sells, I had already crossed the distance between us and was reaching into my jacket pocket for the handkerchief I carried on every shoot, the one for brides who cried before they meant to. I didn't hand it to her. I used it myself, gently, at her jaw, at the line of her throat, the way you'd tend to someone you'd been given permission to touch. Except no one had given me permission. I had just decided the years hadn't erased the instinct. She let me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Rain kept falling around us in that steady, indifferent way storms do when they've decided to stay a while, and the noise of the reception behind us went muffled and small, like it belonged to some other night entirely. Sera's eyes stayed on mine the whole time I worked the damp cloth along her jaw, and I was aware, in a way that made my own hands unsteady, of exactly how little space was left between us. "You didn't have to come out here," she said finally. "Neither did you." I needed to not be in that room for a while. Everyone in there wants something from me. My mother wants me composed. My sister wants me happy for her without needing anything of my own. The Reyes family wants a toast that doesn't mention the divorce settlement I handled for their cousin 2 years ago. A faint, humorless laugh. Out here, at least, the rain doesn't want anything. "I don't want anything from you either," I said, quieter than I meant to. Or, "That's not true. I want a lot of things from you. I just don't know how to ask for any of them without it going the way it went last time." "You looked for me," I said quietly. It wasn't a question anymore. Something about her stillness in the storm had loosened it out of me. "You said that earlier. In the room." "I did. I changed my number 2 weeks after the greenhouse." "I know. I called the studio instead, twice." Her eyes didn't leave mine. "Your assistant at the time told me you'd moved on to bigger clients and didn't have room for charity events anymore. I assumed that meant me." "I never said that." My chest went tight. "I fired that assistant 8 months later for something else entirely. I swear to you, I never—" "I believe you." And there was something in the way she said it, something stripped of all the careful control she wore like armor, that made me realize how much it had cost her to say it at all. "I heard you tell your mother in that hallway. I heard you say I was just the photographer, that it meant nothing." Her whole face changed, not softened, cracked, the way ice cracks under weight it wasn't built to hold. "You heard the end of a sentence, Maeve." "Not the whole thing." Someone called her name from inside, one of the groom's family, something about the getaway car and a missing garter, and the moment folded closed around us like it always did. 3 years of unfinished sentences, swallowed by other people's small emergencies. She touched my hand once, quick, barely there, before she walked back inside to be the fixer everyone needed her to be. I stood on that terrace a long time after she'd gone, rain soaking through my dress, thinking that for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't sure I'd understood anything at all. Brunch the next morning was held in the estate's glass-walled conservatory, all white linen and mimosas and the particular exhaustion of people who had danced too much the night before. I was there to photograph candids, tired brides in borrowed cardigans, hungover groomsmen laughing too loud at their own jokes. I was trying, as I always tried around the Whitlocks, to be furniture with a lens. Cordelia found me refilling my coffee at the sideboard. "You did lovely work last night," she said, in the tone she used for compliments that were actually inspections. "Juliet says you always know exactly where to stand. It's a gift, being so unobtrusive. Staff who understand their place usually are. I have been called worse things by worse people, and I had a whole professional persona built for exactly this kind of comment, the polite nod, the thank you, the retreat. I opened my mouth to give her all three. "She isn't staff," Sera said, from somewhere behind her mother's shoulder, in a voice that could have frozen the mimosas in their glasses. "She is a guest at this wedding, who is also doing us the professional courtesy of documenting it beautifully, and I would ask you to speak to her the way you'd speak to anyone else you respected enough to invite into this house." Cordelia's mouth thinned. "I only meant—" "I know exactly what you meant." Sera didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "You've meant it for 34 years about half the people I've ever cared about." She walked away before her mother could answer, back toward Juliet and the wedding party, leaving Cordelia to recompose her face into something pleasant for the other guests, murmuring something about needing to check on the florist's invoice that fooled absolutely no one standing close enough to have heard the exchange. I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, and my chest doing something complicated and warm that I didn't have a name for yet. Half embarrassment, half a feeling I hadn't let myself have in 3 years. The specific, dangerous feeling of being defended by someone who didn't have to defend you, and did it anyway. Across the conservatory, Juliet caught my eye over her husband's shoulder. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. Her small, knowing smile said it for her. And later, when I found her alone by the pastry table refilling her mimosa, she leaned in and said, low enough that only I could hear, "My sister has never once corrected our mother in front of guests. Not for me, not for our cousins, not even at her own wedding. You should know what that means, even if you're too stubborn to ask her outright. It doesn't have to mean anything." "Sure," Juliet said, entirely unconvinced, and patted my arm on her way back to her husband, leaving me to finish my coffee alone, with that sentence sitting heavy in my chest for the rest of the morning. I went home 3 days later and did what I always did after a wedding. I disappeared into my studio and let the photographs tell me what I'd missed, while I was too busy living the day to see it clearly. It took me until nearly midnight and 400 frames before I understood what I was looking at. There was Sera in the ceremony aisle, watching me instead of watching her sister walk down it, for exactly the 2 seconds before she caught herself and looked away. There was Sera at the reception, angling her body slightly in front of mine when a drunk groomsman stumbled too close with a raised glass, a reflex so small I hadn't even registered it happening in real time. There was Sera on the dance floor, not dancing, just standing at the edge of the room with her champagne untouched. And there, I zoomed in, heart doing something unfamiliar in my chest. There was Sera smiling, really smiling, the kind she never let anyone see, aimed directly and entirely at me across a crowded room. In the 1/2 second she must have believed no one was looking. I sat with that photograph for a long time. Nina found me there the next afternoon, still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by proof sheets and 3 empty coffee mugs I didn't remember making. She looked at the screen, looked at me, and pulled up a stool without asking. "Show me," she said, and I did, scrolling back to the shot of Sera's half-second smile aimed across a crowded dance floor. Nina studied it for a long moment, longer than she usually gave any single frame, and then looked at me with an expression I didn't often see on her, something almost tender under the usual dry humor. "Maeve, that's not a woman who feels nothing." "I know. You've known for a week, and you're still sitting in here at midnight instead of picking up a phone. I don't know how to ask her anything without it turning into 3 years ago again. What if I call and it's 4 words all over again? Except this time I don't even have the excuse of a storm and a greenhouse to blame it on." "Then don't ask. Show up. You're better at showing up in pictures than you are with words, so use what you've got." She nudged the laptop closed before I could argue, the way she always did when she'd decided a conversation was over whether I agreed or not. Also, she left her cufflink in the greenhouse Thursday night, the antique one, the Whitlock crest, and Juliet asked if you could return it, since apparently you're the only person Sera will actually let into her office without an appointment. I told Juliet you'd handle it. You're welcome. You told her that without asking me. I've known you 4 years, Callahan. I know exactly what you need before you're brave enough to admit you need it. She stood, stretched, and headed for the door, pausing just long enough to add, "Wear the green blouse. Not for her. For you. You look like yourself in it, and I think you're about to need to remember who that is." I didn't believe that last part until I was standing in the lobby of a downtown law firm 3 days later, in the green blouse, giving my name to a receptionist who looked at me like she already knew exactly who I was and had been told, in no uncertain terms, to send me straight through. "Ms. Callahan," the receptionist said, standing before I'd finished the sentence. "She's expecting you. 14th floor, end of the hall." The elevator ride felt longer than it had any right to. I spent it rehearsing 3 different versions of what I might say, none of which survived contact with the moment the elevator doors opened onto a hallway of glass-walled conference rooms and hushed, expensive carpet, at the end of which I could already see her through the open door of her office, dark auburn hair pinned back, reading glasses pushed up into it, utterly absorbed in a document she was marking up with a red pen, like it had personally offended her. Sera's office was exactly what I expected, and nothing like what I expected at once. Glass walls, a skyline view, case files stacked with surgical precision, everything about the space built to intimidate opposing counsel into settling before lunch, diplomas in dark frames. A single orchid on the windowsill, alive, tended, which surprised me more than it should have. And then, on one low shelf behind her desk, out of place among the law books and legal awards, an old film camera, the kind I hadn't used since my first year in the business, and beside it, framed, a photograph I recognized instantly because I had taken it. It was her, 3 years ago, in the greenhouse, caught mid-laugh at something I'd said, rain-streaked glass behind her, and orchids in soft focus at the edges of the frame. I had never given her a copy. I hadn't even known that shot had survived. I'd assumed I'd deleted the whole set out of self-preservation, the week after everything fell apart. "You kept it," I said. Sera looked up from her desk, and for a moment, the composed attorney fell away entirely, leaving something younger and far less certain in her face. "I printed it myself. I didn't have the negative, only what you'd emailed me that week, before." She stopped. "Before you stopped emailing me anything. I brought your cufflink. Keep it." She stood, came around the desk slowly, the way you'd approach something you were afraid of startling. "I don't want it back. I want you to sit down and let me finish a sentence. If you'll let me." I sat. "My mother found out about the greenhouse the next morning," Sera said. "Not what happened in it. Nothing happened, we both know that. But that we'd been alone together for 2 hours during a storm, and that it had clearly been more than professional courtesy on either side. She came to me before you were even awake in the guest wing. She told me if I embarrassed this family by, in her words, taking up with the help, she would make sure your business never got another referral from anyone she knew. And in my mother's circle, that is not a small threat. It is most of the wedding industry on the East Coast." My stomach turned over slowly. "Sera, I said what I said in that hallway to protect you from her, Maeve. I told her it meant nothing, because I thought if she believed that, she would leave you alone. I did not think you were standing close enough to hear it. I have spent 3 years wishing I had turned around and finished the sentence, which was that it meant nothing to her, that you meant everything to me, and that I would rather lose my mother's approval 100 times over than lose the only person who ever looked at me and saw something worth photographing instead of something worth using." Her voice, finally, broke on the last word. "I looked for you for months. I am not lying about that. I stood up because I couldn't stay sitting with all of that in my chest at once. I heard 4 words, Sera. 4 words changed 3 years of my life. I know." She was close now, close enough that I could see her hands shaking again, the way they had on the terrace, the way they must have shaken the night in the greenhouse when she almost closed the distance between us and didn't. I am not asking you to forgive 3 years in one afternoon. I am asking you to let me try. I don't remember deciding to close the last of the distance between us. I remember her hand coming up to my jaw, careful, like she still expected me to pull away, her thumb tracing once along my cheekbone before her fingers slid back into my hair. And I remember thinking, with the last clear thought I had before everything narrowed down to the feeling of her mouth against mine, that I had spent 3 years being angry at the wrong sentence. The kiss was slow before it wasn't. Careful, at first, both of us testing whether this was actually allowed, whether 3 years of silence could really be undone this simply. Then her hand tightened in my hair, and mine found the lapel of her blazer, and held on like the floor might tilt if I let go, and the careful thing between us gave way to something hungrier, something that tasted like relief and grief and want, all tangled together into one motion. She backed me gently against the edge of her desk, papers forgotten, one hand braced beside my hip, and for a long moment, there was nothing in that glass office except the sound of both of us trying to breathe, through a kiss neither of us seemed willing to be the one to end. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing like we'd run somewhere instead of just standing still, she pressed her forehead to mine, her hand still framing my face like she wasn't ready to let go of the proof that this was real. "I have wanted to do that for 3 years and 4 days, she said, low, and I laughed, wet and surprised. Because of course, she'd know the exact number. 3 years and 4 days is oddly specific for someone who claims she wasn't counting. I count everything. It's an unfortunate professional habit." Her thumb traced along my jaw, slower now, reverent in a way that undid me more than the kiss had. I have also, for the record, been imagining several versions of this exact moment that were considerably less interrupted by paperwork. "Careful, counselor, that sounds like an offer." "It might be." Her voice had dropped, rougher than I'd ever heard it, and for one heartbeat I felt the whole room tilt toward something neither of us had decided yet whether we were ready for. Her forehead stayed against mine, her breath unsteady against my mouth, her hand at my waist pulling me the barest inch closer, before she went still, visibly reining herself back with the same discipline I'd watched her use on everyone else her whole life, except this time it was aimed at herself. But not here. Not like this. Not as something rushed between depositions after 3 years of getting it wrong. When I have you, Maeve, I want it to be because we chose it slowly, not because we were making up for lost time. We didn't go further than that. Not because I didn't want to. Every part of me wanted to. Wanted her hands and her mouth and the weight of her against me, until neither of us could pretend restraint mattered anymore. But because something in me needed the next thing between us to be certain instead of urgent. And she seemed to understand that without my saying it, the way she always understood the things I didn't say out loud. She kissed my forehead once, soft, almost unbearably gentle after everything that had just happened between us, and held me against her for a long moment, with nothing romantic in it at all, just two people who had finally stopped running long enough to stand still together. I want to tell you it was simple after that. It wasn't. 2 days later I called her and told her I needed space, sitting on the floor of my studio with my back against the wall because I hadn't trusted myself to say it standing up. I heard the careful way she absorbed it, the silence that meant she was choosing not to argue even though she wanted to. "I'm scared," I admitted, "that you want me because I'm unfinished business. Because 3 years of guilt found a convenient place to land, and once the guilt is paid off, there won't be anything left underneath it." "That is not an unreasonable fear," she said, which surprised me more than if she'd denied it outright. "I have some of my own, if you'd like to hear them." "Tell me." "I am afraid that in trying to move fast enough to make up for lost time, I will frighten you into leaving again. I am afraid that everything I feel for you is going to come out too fast and too much, because I have been holding it back for 3 years, and I don't entirely trust myself to know the difference between urgency and love right now. I would rather wait for you properly than lose you twice by rushing." A pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone quieter. "I also think you should know that I don't say things like this to anyone, ever. My mother would tell you I don't feel things like this at all, so if I sound uncertain, it isn't because I'm not sure about you." It's because I've never done this part out loud before. I sat with that for a moment, tracing a scuff mark on the studio floor with my thumbnail, feeling something in my chest loosen just slightly. Take the space, she said, before I could answer. I'll still be here. I'm not going anywhere, Maeve. I've had 3 years of practice not going anywhere, even when I thought you'd never come back. It was the kind of promise that should have been easy to believe and wasn't, not at first. Not with 3 years of evidence telling me that promises from Whitlocks came with fine print attached. But she kept it. She didn't call, didn't push, sent nothing but a single photograph 1 week in, the greenhouse shot from her office shelf, scanned and emailed with no caption at all, and let me come back to her on my own time instead of hers. I found myself checking my phone for that photograph more often than I wanted to admit, studying the rain on the glass and her half-startled laugh, and slowly, over the course of that week, the fear that had been sitting in my chest since the kiss began, quietly, to loosen its grip. Cordelia, predictably, did not let it rest that easily. She came to my studio on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, in a coat that cost more than my monthly rent, and sat in the chair across from my desk like she owned the building, which, in some sense that mattered to people like her, she believed she did. I'll be direct, she said, setting her gloves neatly in her lap. Sera destroys everything she gets close to. Her marriage, before you knew her, did she tell you about that? 2 years, and she came out of it colder than she went in, colder than I've ever known how to warm back up. I watched it happen from the outside, watched her build walls I couldn't get through even as her mother. I am not eager to watch it happen again, this time to someone with far less protecting them than my daughter has. I can protect myself, Mrs. Whitlock. Can you? It wasn't a question. She let her eyes travel around my studio, the exposed brick, the second-hand furniture I'd refinished myself, the modest rack of client albums stacked along one wall, and I watched her catalog every sign of a life built without a family safety net, filing it away as evidence for whatever argument she was about to make. You built this alone, I understand. Admirable, genuinely. But it also means you have no cushion, Miss Callahan. No name that protects you when things go wrong. If my daughter decides in a year that she's frightened of what she feels, and retreats the way she always has, you will be the one left standing in the wreckage, not her. She will simply go back to her office and her cases and her very well-defended heart, and you will have lost the version of your life you might have built if you hadn't spent a year orbiting a woman who cannot commit to anything that isn't written into a contract. She set an envelope on my desk, unhurried, the way she probably closed every negotiation she'd ever sat through. There is a very generous consulting contract in there. 3 national magazines, connections it would take you a decade to build on your own, introductions I can make with a single phone call. All you'd need to do is find somewhere else to be for a while. Let this settle the way it should have settled 3 years ago, before either of you got hurt worse than a misunderstanding warranted. I looked at the envelope for a long time. I won't pretend the offer didn't tempt some old, tired part of me, the part that had grown up watching my mother work 2 jobs and still come up short every month. The part that had spent a career being grateful for scraps of opportunity from people who had more of everything than they knew what to do with. That part of me had learned early that love from people like the Whitlocks always came with a price tag attached, and an expiration date. That being wanted by someone with money and a name meant eventually being asked, politely, to disappear once you'd served your purpose. 3 years ago, I would have taken the envelope and run before she finished her sentence, and I would have told myself I was being smart instead of scared. I'm not going anywhere this time, I said instead, and slid the envelope back across the desk. And if Sera destroys things, Mrs. Whitlock, I'd like to hear that from her, not from someone who's spent 30 years teaching her that love has terms and conditions. Cordelia left without another word, but her face, for just a second, looked less like a woman who'd won, and more like a woman who understood, somewhere underneath the polish, that she'd finally lost this particular fight. I called Juliet that night, mostly because I needed to hear a Whitlock voice that didn't make my chest tighten. She picked up on the second ring, already laughing before I'd said anything. She told you not to see Sera, didn't she? Juliet said. She did the same thing to a boy I dated in college, offered him an internship at a firm 2 states away, so subtle he thanked her for it, before he figured out what she'd actually done. Different script, same ending. How did you know it was her? Because my mother doesn't do anything by accident, and because my sister has been in love with you since before I even got engaged, Maeve. I watched her ask about you at every industry event she could justify attending for 3 straight years. Always so casual about it. Always somehow already knowing whether you'd photographed some gallery opening or gotten written up in some magazine, and then changing the subject fast if anyone noticed she'd asked. She thought none of us noticed. We all noticed. My cousin Delphine started a betting pool at one point about how long it would take her to actually do something about it. A betting pool? I won $40 off it, actually, the day I found out you were doing my wedding photos. I knew the second I saw the way she looked at your name on the vendor contract. Juliet's voice softened, all the teasing dropping out of it. She's never once looked at anyone the way she looks at you. Not even close. Not even the woman she married. Whatever my mother said to you today, please don't let it be the reason you two lose more time than you've already lost. You don't know what she was like for those 3 years. I do. I watched my sister go quiet in a way I'd never seen before, and I always assumed it was just more of the same coldness, until I found her once, at 2 a.m, looking through some folder of photography credits online, and I finally understood. We walked the cliff path near the estate 2 days after that, Juliet and I, at her insistence, for old time's sake. Though we both knew it was really so, she could watch her sister and me stand close together at the overlook without either of us noticing she'd engineered it. The same way she'd engineered half the wedding seating chart to put Sera near enough to me that I couldn't avoid her all night if I tried. The wind off the water was sharp and salt clean, gulls wheeling low over the waves crashing against the rocks below, and Sera's hand found mine on the trail without either of us discussing whether that was allowed yet. My mother came to see you, Sera said, not quite a question, somewhere along the 2nd mile of the path. She did. I assume there was an envelope involved? There was a very generous envelope involved. Sera exhaled slowly, looking out at the water instead of at me. I'm sorry. I should have warned you she'd do that. I've watched her do it to nearly everyone I've ever cared about, and I still somehow believed, foolishly, that she might leave you alone. I turned it down. I know you did. Juliet told me before you'd even left your studio. A small, disbelieving laugh escaped her, the sound of someone still catching up to good news. My mother is going to be insufferable about losing this particular argument for the rest of her natural life. Let her be insufferable. I tightened my hand around hers. I've survived worse than your mother's disapproval. I think I can survive her insufferable too, if it means I get to keep doing this. I gestured at the space between us, at her hand in mine, at the whole absurd, terrifying, wanted thing we were building. She smiled at that. The real smile, and I decided, walking that cliff path with the wind trying to steal every word before it reached either of us, that whatever came next, I wasn't going anywhere. The formal Whitlock family dinner came a week later, the kind of event where the silverware had more history than most families, and every sentence was delivered like a closing argument. It was held in the estate's formal dining room, dark wood and portraits of Whitlocks going back generations, a table long enough that Cordelia sat at one end like a judge presiding over her own courtroom. I came as Sera's guest, not her photographer, in a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and then second-guessed 3 separate times before Nina physically confiscated my phone to stop me from canceling. I felt every eye at that table measure the difference between the woman who usually stood behind a camera in the corner of these rooms and the one now seated at Sera's right hand, and I made myself sit up straight through all of it. Juliet's husband made pleasant small talk about the honeymoon. An aunt I hadn't met asked polite, careful questions about my work that felt less like curiosity and more like an audit. Sera's hand found my knee under the table at one point, steadying, and I understood without being told that she'd noticed exactly how nervous I was and had decided, quietly, to anchor me through it without making a show of the gesture. Cordelia waited until the second course to strike, smooth as always, dropping her comment into a lull in the conversation like a stone into still water. It's interesting, she said, to no one and everyone, setting down her wine glass with a precision that felt rehearsed. How quickly some people learn to sit at tables they weren't born to. The room went quiet. I felt Sera go rigid beside me, felt her drawing breath to defend me the way she always did, fast and precise and merciless when it came to protecting the people she loved. I put my hand lightly on her arm before she could. "I wasn't born to this table, that's true," I said, meeting Cordelia's eyes directly, keeping my voice as level as I could make it. "I was born to a kitchen table in a town you've never heard of, to a mother who worked 2 jobs and never once made me feel like I needed permission to want more than what I was given. I built a career with my own hands, one wedding at a time, and I don't apologize for any part of that story. If sitting at this table requires pretending I'm ashamed of where I came from, I'll happily eat somewhere else. But I don't think that's actually the problem here, is it? I think the problem is that your daughter loves someone you don't get to control, and you're punishing me because you can't punish her." Nobody spoke. Juliet's husband coughed into his napkin in a way that might have been hiding a laugh. And Sera, beside me, took my hand under the table and held it so tightly it nearly hurt, looking at me like I had just done something she'd waited her whole life to see someone do at that particular table. Cordelia didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. But she didn't say another word to me for the rest of the meal, and something about the silence felt, for the first time, like ground I'd actually won, rather than territory I was merely being permitted to borrow. Later, after dessert, when the table had splintered into smaller conversations, and Sera had been pulled away by an uncle wanting legal advice he clearly intended never to pay for, Juliet found me on the terrace catching my breath. "That was the single greatest thing I have ever witnessed at that table," she said, handing me a glass of wine I hadn't asked for but was grateful to have anyway. "My mother has been trying to intimidate people into silence at that dinner table since before I could talk. Nobody has ever just said the true thing back to her like that." I surprised myself a little. "You shouldn't have. It's exactly the kind of thing my sister loves about you, in case you hadn't noticed. She's spent her whole life being the only one willing to stand up to our mother. I don't think it occurred to her that she could fall in love with someone who'd stand up right alongside her, instead of needing to be protected from her." Juliet bumped her shoulder gently against mine, echoing, without either of us realizing it, the exact gesture Nina used when she wanted to say something kind without making it a whole production. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it's you. I've never seen my sister this unguarded around anyone in my entire life." Inside, through the tall windows, I could see Sera extracting herself politely from her uncle's questions, glancing toward the terrace like she already knew exactly where to find me, and something settled in my chest that had been unsettled for 3 years. The wedding album was finished 6 weeks later, after long nights in my studio choosing which 400 images out of thousands deserved to survive into the permanent record of Juliet's wedding, and long nights, too, that had nothing to do with editing at all, spent instead learning the particular rhythm of a relationship with Sera that wasn't rushed and wasn't hidden, dinners at her apartment, quiet mornings at mine, the strange, wonderful ordinariness of a woman I'd once believed I would only ever know as an ache. Juliet asked me to bring the finished album to a small family gathering at the estate. Nothing formal, just cake and coffee in the conservatory, where I'd once stood holding a cold cup while Cordelia called me staff. I almost declined. Some old instinct in me still expected that conservatory to be a place where I got hurt, and I said as much to Sera the night before, sitting on my studio floor surrounded by proof sheets, while she absorbed it the way she absorbed everything now, carefully, without rushing me toward feeling better before I was ready. "You don't have to come," she said. "I can deliver the album myself." "No, I want to. I think I need to walk back into that room and have it mean something different this time." I looked up at her. I just needed to say the fear out loud first. She nodded, like that made perfect sense to her, and the next afternoon I brought the album wrapped in brown paper, and I brought Sera's hand in mine on the walk up from the car, deliberately, publicly, the way I hadn't let myself do at the wedding itself. Cordelia was there, of course, seated near the window with the particular stillness of a woman bracing for something, a stillness I recognized now as the same discipline I'd once mistaken for coldness in her daughter, except in Cordelia it had curdled into something closed instead of something protective. When I set the album on the table and Juliet opened it, gasping at the greenhouse scene collage I'd made her as a surprise, orchids and rain glass and her sister's hidden smile, stitched together into something that looked, finally, like the truth of that whole weekend. Cordelia's composure cracked in a way I'd never seen it crack before. "You've turned my family into a story about her," she said quietly, nodding at me without looking at me. "No, Mother." Sera stood, and there was nothing controlled left in her voice at all. Nothing guarded, nothing performed for anyone's benefit but her own honesty. "I turned myself into a story about her, 3 years ago, in a greenhouse, and I have spent every year since regretting that I let you convince me to pretend otherwise. I love her. I have loved her since before I understood what that would cost me, and I am done paying that cost in silence. If you cannot sit at a table with the person I've chosen, then I suppose we will have very small holidays from now on, but I would rather have small holidays with the truth than large ones built on what I'm allowed to feel." The room held its breath. Juliet reached for her mother's hand, quiet and steady, the way she'd learned to hold a room together from watching her sister do it her whole life. And Cordelia, after a long moment, looked at me. Really looked. The way you look at someone you've decided to stop underestimating, and said, stiffly, "The photograph of the greenhouse is very good. You have a gift for making people look like themselves when they least expect it." It wasn't an apology. From Cordelia Whitlock, I understood. It was as close as I would ever get, and I decided that afternoon that it was enough. Sera crossed the room and kissed me, unhurried, in front of her mother and her sister, and the album full of everything we'd almost lost, and I stopped counting. Finally, all the rooms I'd once run out of. My gallery show opened on a bright evening the following spring, in a small converted warehouse space 2 blocks from my studio. String lights strung across exposed beams and 40 of my favorite photographs mounted along whitewashed brick. I'd quietly titled the collection after something Nina said to me months earlier, half joking, about the moments most people are too busy living to notice. Photographs of hands finding each other under tables, of glances held a half-second too long, of the exact instant someone stops pretending not to feel something. There was no grand statement on the wall about what the collection meant, no artist note explaining the greenhouse shot given pride of place at the center of the far wall, orchids and rain glass and a stranger's hidden smile that most visitors would never know was the whole reason any of the other photographs existed at all. Nina worked the room all night in a blazer she swore she only owned for gallery openings, introducing me to critics and old clients with the pride of someone who'd watched every uncertain step of the 4 years it had taken to get here. Juliet came with her husband and cried, unapologetically, in front of the greenhouse photograph, holding my arm and saying, "You made us all look like we were in a story worth telling," which was, I decided, the nicest thing anyone had ever said about my work. Sera came not as a guest slipping in through a side door, not as someone's sister trying not to be noticed, but on my arm from the very first minute, introduced without hesitation to everyone who asked, laughing at something I whispered to her near the greenhouse photograph, while a photographer I'd hired for the night, my own small private joke, caught the picture without either of us posing for it. Even Cordelia came, briefly, standing a long time in front of the album collage before saying only, stiffly, that the lighting work was impressive, which from her I had learned by then was practically a love letter. Later, after the crowd thinned and the wine ran low, and Nina all but pushed us both out the door insisting she'd handle the cleanup, Sera drove us out to the coast, to the Whitlock estate, to the greenhouse that had been quietly restored that winter at her own request, she told me. Orchids blooming again under glass, soft lantern light instead of storm shadows, the potting bench replaced but positioned in exactly the same spot. "No interruptions this time," she said, closing the door behind us, and I heard the echo of another door closing 3 years before, except this time, there was no misunderstanding waiting on the other side of it, no cruel sentence overheard out of context, no family threat hovering in the next room. Just rain-clean glass and white flowers, and her hand finding mine the way it always seemed to. Eventually, no matter how many years or misunderstandings stood in the way. "I'm not avoiding you anymore," I said. I noticed. She smiled. The real one, the one I'd once believed only my camera was allowed to catch, the one I now got to see nearly every day. over coffee, across a pillow, in the middle of ordinary arguments about whose turn it was to pick the restaurant. I'm not hiding anything anymore either. I told my partners at the firm about you last week, properly, not as a rumor they were meant to politely ignore. I want people to know. I'm done being the daughter everyone assumes feels nothing. You never felt nothing. No, she agreed, her hand coming up to rest against my jaw, the same gesture from that first stormy terrace, except steady now, instead of shaking. I felt entirely too much, for entirely too long, and I was simply too afraid to let anyone see it, including you, including myself. She tipped my chin up gently. I don't want to be afraid of that anymore. I would like to spend the rest of however long you'll have me proving it. I didn't have a clever answer for that, which was rare enough that she noticed, laughing softly against my mouth as she kissed me, slowly, deliberately, like a sentence she finally had all the time in the world to finish. Outside the glass, the evening had gone soft and clear, none of the storm that had chased us together 3 years earlier, just the quiet hush of the coast and the orchids breathing their pale perfume into the warm air around us. And I understood, standing there in the exact spot where all of this had almost happened once before, that we had finally, both of us, stopped running.